The White House, as Muscovites know it, is the bright marble building at the very heart of the city. It's now the headquarters of the Russian government, but was once home to the Supreme Soviet of Russia, the main legislative body in the country. In October 1993, Russia was on the brink of civil war, with parliament deputies on one side and Boris Yeltsin and his supporters on the other. 2 days of street fighting left hundreds dead and injured. Not far from the Supreme Soviet building is where Svetlana Kuzmina often comes to visit her son's grave. Sergei was only 17 when he died in the turmoil of October 1993. The official record says he was killed by multiple bullet injuries.
I asked the prosecutor's office for my son's clothes to see where he was wounded. They didn't give them to me and destroyed them before the investigation was completed.
College student Sergei was a supporter of neither the president nor the Legislative Assembly. He simply went to the White House with a friend to see what was going on. On the eve of his death, Sergei argued with his mother.
He said, "Why don't you vote? Why is it that you vote for father instead of him? I want to vote for myself. That's why I'm going there, to find out who is right and who is wrong. I want to decide my country's fate."
Sergei would never see the final moments of confrontation between Russia's parliament and president. Yeltsin, who controlled tank divisions, would give the order to fire directly at the parliament building, with shells pounding the offices of the Supreme Soviet chairman and the vice president, who sided with the deputies.
People were watching from that very bridge, welcoming each shot with applause. That's the kind of people we are. We stood there and clapped.
Tank shells were fired at the Supreme Soviet deputies. They had once been Yeltsin's colleagues. In August 1991, there was a communist coup to prevent the collapse of the Soviet Union. At that time, Russian President Yeltsin and his followers took refuge in the Supreme Soviet building. Yeltsin won that battle and the White House survived. 2 years later, Yeltsin and those same deputies found themselves on opposite sides.
A lot of Yeltsin supporters had second thoughts. If in 1991 I had been the only one in Parliament against the collapse of the Soviet Union and against the ratification of the necessary agreements, by 1993 most of the deputies shared the same view.
The USSR's collapse led to a tough ordeal for many people. TV footage of endless queues and empty shops remain a timeless image. Thousands found themselves way below the poverty line. The old economic system crashed overnight. Among those who supported Yeltsin, such as then Prime Minister Yegor Gaidar, there were calls for radical reform.
Yeltsin was aware that the Soviet Union's bankruptcy and lack of currency to buy grain had resulted in an economic disaster. It put him in a tough situation that had to be dealt with.
In April 1993, the people of Russia voted in a referendum on supporting the president and his reform program. Almost 59% backed Yeltsin. However, each side of the political conflict interpreted those results in its own way.
There was a moment when an agreement could have been reached. But then Rutskoy and Hasbulatov said that only drug addicts and drunkards voted for Yeltsin. And things spun out of control again.
Russian citizens have seen what the deputies that they had chosen are really occupied with. The same faces behind the microphones, saying the same things, calling for an overthrow.
Deputies began to block all of the president's initiatives. Economist Ruslan Khasbalatov, then Supreme Soviet Speaker, openly claimed that the president was behind each and every economic and social disaster.
These disagreements took root above all in his expansionist ambition, in his longing for dictatorial power and tyranny. And economic reform only exacerbated these disagreements.
In the last days before the crisis, Ruslan Khasbalatov showed his colleagues a flak jacket that he wore under his shirt. Even then, the possibility of military confrontation between Parliament and the President was considered a joke. Nobody could possibly imagine what consequences might follow.
Parliament deputies decided that at the next conference that they would vote to initiate Yeltsin's impeachment. In addition, Yeltsin learned that many weapons were being gathered in Parliament. It became obvious that there was no other way to resolve the situation.
From this day forward, the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Federation and its deputies discontinue their legislative, administrative, and executive functions.
Deputies responded with a decree removing Yeltsin from the presidency. Vice President Alexander Rudskoy was appointed as the country's new head. Yeltsin ignored Parliament and surrounded the White House with barbed wire. Eventually, society split in two. One half blamed Yeltsin for the political crisis. The other called on the Supreme Soviet to resign voluntarily.
Yeltsin won the elections. What happened in 1993 was two groups fighting for power. We voted for Yeltsin in the referendum. Deputies of the Supreme Soviet didn't appeal to us at all. We had to support Yeltsin, otherwise it would have been civil war. Down with the government!
A communist rally in central Moscow. Many of these people who supported the Supreme Soviet were convinced that Yeltsin's resignation would make it possible to reinstate the fallen Soviet Union and put an end to poverty. Their slogans were chanted outside the walls of the White House.
We came to defend Soviet power above all else, and the parliament that had been elected at that moment. Well, not the parliament, but the Supreme Soviet of Russia.
Patriarch Alexei II took on the role of intermediary in those early days of confrontation. Negotiations were conducted at the Patriarch's residence. Church ministers suggested a zero-sum option to both sides. Boris Yeltsin would agree to retract Decree 1400, which effectively dismissed the parliament, while the deputies would revoke the president's impeachment.
The negotiations were not easy. They started with each side calling the other our enemy and our foe. I begged them to stop talking like that, because the purpose of the meeting was to find a way out of the crisis that had engulfed our country.
Yeltsin's gang's on trial.
On the 3rd of October 1993, a crowd of Supreme Soviet supporters broke through the police cordon, wielding stones and iron clubs. The police responded with tear gas. This clash brought about the first injuries and spilled the first blood in this turbulent time. The Patriarch's negotiations were cut short. From the very first moments of conflict, a startling theory began to emerge: that the fighting between the opposing Yeltsin and Supreme Soviet supporters was being inflamed by a mysterious third force.
Over there on Devyatinsky Lane, just to the right, there's a 9-story building. I noticed that standing on its roof was a man in civilian clothes holding a sniper rifle. I saw him aiming it, although I didn't see him fire it. I tried to take a picture of him, but at that exact moment, I was wounded.
Meanwhile, Vice President Rudskoy gives the order to storm City Hall, directly in front of Moscow's White House, with the words, "Find and punish the snipers."
So they broke through the cordon. What for? To take the building? It's not going anywhere. The goal was to grab the rats hiding within, but they managed to escape through the hotel adjacent to the White House.
In just a few moments, City Hall is captured and the police surrender. The operation is commanded by General Albert Makashov, a communist known for never mincing his words.
Cut those telephone connections off! Kick the f***ing bureaucrats out!
Both Khasbulatov and Rudskoy, who's a military man himself, fell under the wheels of the most radical group of White House defenders. And these two were not in charge anymore. It was the chiefs of the military units who were in command, and they had absolutely no need for negotiations.
Meanwhile, Rudskoy set a new objective: to control the broadcast network by occupying the government-run Ostankino National TV Center. Transport is readily at hand. Trucks with full fuel tanks captured from the police. Vitya's special forces under Yeltsin's control also head to Ostankino. Captain Igor Chekolayev was given an order on this staircase: hide behind the second-floor parapet and secure the building until the end. The position that the soldiers were forced to take up put them at a tactical disadvantage, but there was no other choice.
You could only shoot from this position, which left your chest completely exposed. And if you were on your knees, you couldn't see anything. So we were just sort of bent over. They were afraid to shoot right away. I remember it well. They gave us about 3 minutes to make a decision.
General Makashov ordered a TV cameraman to be brought to him so he could deliver a speech live on air. But Spetsnaz officers refused to obey. A rally broke out at the entrance to the TV center, with more and more people joining in every minute. The majority had no idea that Special Forces soldiers had guns trained on the crowd. Photographer Alexei Baitsov has no difficulty finding bullet holes at the television center. He came to Ostankino with a group of Supreme Soviet supporters. It still remains unclear how a column of armed people was able to march so easily across the whole of Moscow.
I'm not the one to judge who was right and who was wrong. My first duty as a reporter is to document the event. Commenting on it isn't my job. But the fact is that at this very spot, they were shooting at me. And not only me, that's for sure.
At around 8 o'clock, the first attempt to break into the TV center was launched. They used trophy police trucks. Special Forces soldiers who were holding the line inside remained silent, further provoking the attacking mob.
I said, "Let me shoot the radiator, they're coming in." And the reply was, "Don't even think of opening fire." That's the sort of command we were given. The people here were already on edge, afraid of those coming inside with weapons. And there we were, sitting around like cannon fodder.
In this picture, one assailant holds an anti-tank grenade launcher. They had easily seized weapons from the officers who had been guarding City Hall. According to the Special Forces version of events, the first shot at the Ostankino TV center was fired from this very grenade launcher. As a result, one young soldier, Nikolai Sitnikov, was fatally injured. In response to their comrade's death, the elite soldiers opened fire indiscriminately. Anyone at the main entrance was literally doomed.
I fell flat to the ground, hiding behind the flower bed, and crawled along it in this direction so that it would keep me out of sight of those firing from the TV center. That's how I survived. There was one man who called out to the Special Forces officers, "I'm dragging an injured man away. Don't interfere or he'll die." And he turned his back to the officers. There was a burst of gunfire, and he dropped dead.
Reminders of that battle remain to this day. The bullets that caused these holes at the TV center were fired by both sides. The investigation took a long time, but Special Forces eventually conceded that their story about the first shots coming from the assailants was false.
We tested the grenade launcher and visited the internal military training ground. All of them told us point blank that the grenade launcher was not fired inside the television center, and that Officer Sitnikov's death has no relation to it.
Nevertheless, the majority of Muscovites who took to the streets that night in support of Yeltsin were convinced that the Ostankino slaughter had been unleashed by Supreme Soviet followers.
At the rally, they called for people to take up arms and defend democracy. Similar appeals were heard on TV. As a result, after the rally, people really went to the White House the next morning, and some of them died there after being shot by their own government troops.
This is how the square in front of the White House looked at dawn on the 4th of October 1993. Many of these people have little more than an hour to live. Soon after 6 o'clock in the morning, the barricades would be torn down by Yeltsin's forces.
The first victims of that horrible day lay here. I saw them from the window of the Supreme Soviet building. They were two young guys who had been shot beside a shallow trench. I think that was probably the most depressing image of all.
This is how the streets next to the White House looked on the 4th of October 1993. Again, journalists found themselves in the firing line, as unknown snipers on the rooftops of nearby buildings opened fire indiscriminately. Rustem Safronov, a journalist for a Russian state TV channel, was never able to finish his report.
He's been hit in the back.
He's the fifth reporter I've seen hit by a bullet today.
A bullet lodged in his left lung. The sniper was apparently aiming for the heart, but missed. Journalists began to notice that the mysterious snipers were not acting by chance. Their shots provoked reciprocal cruelty and revenge from both sides.
Certainly it was a provocation. We used to be the crew, the people who looks like a media people. We didn't have any weapons, and it's just the instinct of the death. And people, I think, tried to kill a lot of journalists, and because they're witnesses of the different criminal stuff which was conducted there.
For 20 years, it has been claimed in the communist press that the snipers were professional soldiers of fortune who came to Russia at the invitation of the president's security service. The accusation is strongly denied by Yeltsin's followers.
There was no third force whatsoever. All this talk about tall, broad-shouldered Israeli soldiers is nothing more than fantasy. People even go as far as to say that I was seen in Moscow on the 4th of October, meeting them at Kievsky railway station. It's a pack of lies. I was at Yeltsin's side until the end.
These pictures went all around the world. Tanks on the Moscow River embankment firing directly at the Supreme Soviet building. At this moment, former Vice President Rudskoy appeals from inside the White House for the military to rescue the besieged deputies.
Pilots, if you hear me, take off. I beg you, save the dying people. They had to say something in their defense, so they lied that they had used blank or wooden shells. But the building was burning. You remember how much time it took to restore it? How could blank shells cause such damage?
Deputies get together in the conference hall on the 5th floor, where there are no windows. As they hold their last session, it becomes perfectly clear that the army will not back the Supreme Soviet. Rumors soon circulated that Yeltsin had issued an order to his security service. Khasbulatov, head of the Supreme Soviet, and presidential rival Rudskoy are to be finished off, without trial.
I had a loaded pistol in my right pocket. The safety was off. There was a secret, unofficial request. We were told to, if given the chance, do them both in instead of arresting them. We didn't get the chance. There were just too many witnesses.
The The deputies were saved by members of the Alpha counter-terrorism unit, which had once been under KGB control. They were accustomed to working in political hotspots along the borders of the former USSR. Now they were called upon to stop a civil war at home, in the capital. In the afternoon of October the 4th, while under fire from snipers, Alpha officer Sergei Kuzmin began negotiations with the deputies inside the White House.
We all laid our rifles down and started waving our arms, asking them to cease fire. Don't shoot! Our lieutenant colonel is going to talk to you!
Alpha unit soldiers made their way to the 5th floor to talk to the deputies, many of whom were preparing to die.
We told Rutskoy we could get the deputies out through the security corridor, put them on buses, and drive them to the nearest metro station. He asked whether we could take Hasbulatov and him to the American embassy. We told him that it was possible, but that we had to consult our superiors first. After sorting everything out, I had to report to my chiefs. I pressed a button on the radio and suddenly heard random shooting and screaming. I couldn't understand what was happening and switched the radio off immediately to avoid panic.
During these few seconds, an unknown sniper shoots down Gennady Sergeyev, an Alpha unit officer trying to carry an injured comrade away from the kill zone. But the intended provocation failed.
Some wanted this conflict to go on, others wanted our unit to react to the provocation, but it led to nothing. After all, we're not mere soldiers, we're officers. We all understand what's going on, and it's impossible to provoke us into improper action.
Despite the death of their comrade, Alpha unit officers kept their promise. Opposition leaders were taken into safety. The Supreme Soviet leaders, though, were still unaware that they were expected in solitary confinement at a former KGB detention center.
I was absolutely sure they would kill me. My sole concern was to put on a good show for the cameras and prove that my deputies' morale was still high.
Ordinary deputies were free to go home after being released from the White House. Those who tried to get to the metro station through adjacent yards, though, had one more humiliation to endure.
The deputies were led out of the storeroom of this shop. It looked different back then. The police recognized me, separated me from the crowd, and pushed me over to that doorway. Over the radio, they received an order to do away with me. Those few minutes were terrible, but luckily the walls are made of concrete, and they were afraid that bullets would ricochet.
Investigators never did discover who ordered people to be shot, nor the identities of the mystery snipers. In early 1994, a new parliament was established in Russia. The State Duma granted amnesty to those involved in the events of October 1993. The criminal investigation was shut down, to the dismay of many.
Whether the state leaders liked it or not, a lot of the authorities' actions that came to light during the investigation should have been deemed nothing less than criminal offenses.
It was a hard period, but we had to live through it. Regular folks, as well as the leaders of the country and the president, we had to go through it.
When the confrontation was finally over, some celebrated victory, while others spent all day and night searching for their loved ones' bodies. More than 120 people lost their lives. Only on the 5th day after the tragedy was Svetlana Kuzmina able to identify her 17-year-old son Sergei at a city morgue.
At one end of the morgue, people were crying. The other end was the same. They were looking for their relatives. I said, I don't want to live anymore. Give me cyanide. I'm dead anyway. I have nothing to live for.
Svetlana did survive, and 6 years later she gave birth to a second son, Alexei. Until now, history books have offered conflicting and inconsistent accounts of the events of October 1993. Alexei has already formed his own vision of those events during his childhood. He's now 14, just like Sergei when this photo was taken.
They look very much alike. It's just that my first son was shot, but Sergei's life continues in Alexei.
It's a pity I never saw my brother. I was born after he died. You can't forget things like that. They remain in your memory forever. People will always remember.
Less than 6 months after the crisis of October 1993, Russia saw a new constitution installed. As a result, the president's powers were expanded considerably. The post of vice president was abolished, while deputies' authority was significantly curtailed. The Moscow White House was repaired in record time and surrounded by a tall fence. Nearby is an open-air memorial where relatives of the dead visit this avenue of remembrance. Despite their determination never to forget, much of what took place here 20 years ago still remains a mystery.